Hello, everybody. It's me, producer Ross, and welcome to another edition of my ITFC. Today, I'm a pleasure to be joined by good old Phil Ham, the man, the editor of TWTD. How you doing? How you been doing during these weird, crazy times? Of course, you've been able to go to games and cover it, but it's been weird, of course, behind closed doors and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's been very strange, and obviously, strange as it has been for everybody, really, in some way or another. Going to football matches with no fans there has been strange. I mean, it's been, I don't know, it's because obviously I've been to football grounds a lot, where there's under 23 games and under 18 games and whatever, where the grounds are empty. But going to a proper game with no fans there is different again, and it sort of lacks that sort of momentum and everything. I can remember one or two games there in the season I've sort of struggled to get into them at the start of the match because there's not been that energy generated by the fans, that excitement, that even as the kickoff's being taken and whatever and all that. So yeah, it's all a bit underwhelming and a bit under par, and games have felt a bit like that. Goals have gone in and the celebrations have seemed a bit under par, haven't they? And the players, because there's not that crowd to bounce off and that, or jump into in some players of the past cases. So it's been, obviously from a TWTD perspective, running a football website during, 5 months without football, a bit taxing, but we sort of managed to get stuff going through quite a lot of it. Advertising revenues, as most people in the media, advertising revenues during that period were very low, but we're fortunate we just about broke even. And things gradually got better in more recent months. Once football started again, traffic kind of keeps going, but I mean, there's the news side of the website, but there's also the forum side of it, which is the community, and I think that community side of TWTD sort of help people get through the kind of lockdown period. And people know that if they're feeling a bit lonely and a bit down, they can go and talk to someone that has some connection with them on our forum. And so there was lots of sort of discussions about mental health and all those kind of things and how people were. And I think someone, at one point, someone's relative somewhere in some part of the country a long way away couldn't get a shopping delivery, so they got someone who's a friend of someone else's friend to go and help them. And so all those kind of things went on. So that was quite nice from that perspective. But it has had its challenges, like it has for everybody else. I was born in Ipswich Hospital. Going right back to the beginning. My dad was originally a Tottenham fan, but him and my mum moved to Suffolk in 1961, and Tottenham had obviously just won the double at that point, and they moved to Suffolk, moved to Kesgrave, and my dad started watching Ipswich, and of course Ipswich won the league that year. My dad did win the league 2 years running, and Ipswich was his club from there, really. He was here. I can't remember him ever going to Tottenham after that. And I know that him and his twin brother, who is a Tottenham fan, had plenty of arguments over town Tottenham matches when we were growing up. I can remember particularly in 1981, I think, when we beat them 3-0 at Portman Road, and arguments when the game was re-shown on Match of the Day later on, raised voices over a particular incident. So yeah, he was very much an Ipswich fan from there on, and I can't remember not being an Ipswich fan really, from him bringing programmes back from the games that he watched in that sort of 75, 76 sort of era, that kind of when I was first becoming conscious of football. And at the time, you may not believe this, but football wasn't shown like live on telly all the time like it is now. Football matches live were very rare events. There's a cup final, the home internationals, I think pretty much it, World Cups. So most of my Ipswich, early Ipswich education was watching Match of the Week and Match of the Day, because of course we were one of the top teams in the country, and so we were on Match of the Day quite regularly, Match of the Week on Anglia, with Jerry Harrison commentating. So that's how I got to know the Beatties and the Hunters and the Wymarks and the Woods and Lamberts and Mariners and all those people first, before I ever set foot at Portman Road. first game was, I just looked it up actually, November 24th, 1979. So I was 8. So I had been to Portman Road for reserve matches, which were played on a Saturday afternoon in those days. And in fact, people used to go, because particularly in the pre-Radio Orwell days, I think it was one of the few places you could actually find out the half-time score was to go to the reserve match at Portman Road, because they'd put it out over the tannoy. Yeah, so I've been to a few reserve games. I can't really remember much other than running about the terraces from those games. I think I can remember seeing Swindon once in the reserves, but I don't remember any score lines or anything like that. But obviously going to a reserve game with hardly anybody there is a very different sort of thing than going to a first division ground, as was, which packed. And yeah, so it was 24th of November 1979, Southampton at home. It was my friend Philip's birthday. He was born exactly a month after me, so it was his birthday the following day. And we went with his dad and I think another friend of ours, and we stood on milk crates at the back of Churchman's, as was common in that era, and we won 3-1. And it was, I can picture the kind of, the sort of vividness of the colours. Do you know what I mean? Standing at the back of the ground and the smell of cigars. That was kind of, that was something that sort of football grounds used to smell of that you don't get anymore. That sort of cigar smoke drifting up. And the sort of the vividness of the green of the pitch and the blue of the shirts. You know what I mean? One of the sort of first things that stood out that I can remember back then. And we were. It was a dominant performance. We won 3-1, and the goals, which I've just watched about 5 minutes ago to make sure I got all the details right. And the first one, Eric Gates. So the first goal I ever saw was Ipswich Town goal I ever saw was Eric Gates lashed into the top corner from the edge of the area. The second goal was John Walk, obviously, had to be. He sort of not that long afterwards. So that's another thing, of course. I don't think you're really prepared for the kind of roar of the crowd, are you? When you sort of, before you go to, and particularly in that era, with the Churchman's was relatively benign for a stand, but like the North Stand, when I sort of was a bit older going to the North Stand, the surges that you used to get in the terraces, but. The noise of the goal in the first one, and then I can't remember how many minutes later, but it wasn't that much later that Walkie got the second, and so roar again. You think brilliant, this is, and then Alan Brazil banged in the third, which is another. I mean, they're really really good goals, the Gates and the Brazil ones. I mean, certainly probably up there in sort of your top sort of 50 goals probably when you sort of go back over your years of watching Town once you get to my age, and and then the second half, Steve Williams pulled one back for Southampton. This wasn't a bad Southampton side. I think Alan Ball was playing for them. Mick Shannon may have been in their team. It was that sort of time. Chris Nichol, people like that, I think. And Steve Williams, who went on to play for England. And then Walkie went off, and Mitch Davray made his debut the same day. And we won a penalty. And of course, Walkie had gone off, so Mariner took it. And of course, Walkie, week in, week out, banging in the penalties in that era. And Mariner took it and he put it over the bar into the back of Churchman. So that's my memories of my first Town game, really. And it was an ideal one to go to. I mean, other things I can remember from that era, whether it was necessarily that game, was chewing gum being thrown into the goal for Paul Cooper. Because Paul Cooper used to chew gum during the game in goal. And so when he used to come out for the warm-up or whatever, or for the second half or whatever, packets of chewing gum had rained down into the back of the goal, and which was something you perhaps wouldn't have known about from TV or whatever. But obviously, when you're at the game, that's the kind of thing. Oh man, that's kind of, and with all these little rituals and things of crowds, you first start to sort of to witness them and kind of be a part of them. And so that was my first experience, and we used to go. Not regularly, because we weren't that well off, so we used to go every now and then, quite often sitting at the side in front of the executive boxes, which was that sort of Portman Terrace as it used to be called, which was sort of a family sort of enclosure in those days. And so I can remember kind of quite a lot of games in that era going, and obviously that was the great glory days of Town, but perhaps a little bit too young to really appreciate quite what we were seeing. That how good we really were, and appreciating the quality of the football and the quality of the players. And perhaps if I'd have been 5-10 years older, then perhaps I'd have a greater appreciation of the football that we witnessed.
Next question is about your favourite Town player. There's a lot of players you've already mentioned from your early days, and I'm sure it is just hard to just choose one. So I'll let you have a few to pick from. But have you got that standalone one that is your favourite?
It's very difficult. I was thinking this because there's so many eras now as well. I mean, when I had my sort of 1978 shirt with the white collar and the Adidas stripes like you're wearing at the moment, my mum put 11 on the back because I was playing as a left winger. So Mick Lambert and Clive Woods were obviously the sort of players I admired. But as you say, it's too difficult just to pick one really from that era. Mariner, I mean, Mariner was a big hit. I ended up playing as a centre forward, and so Mariner and Brazil, particularly that sort of Brazil thing of kind of being on one-on-ones. Because I was in my day, I was a reasonly pacey sort of striker, and people used to belt it over the top for me, and I sort of try and emulate Alan Brazil and taking the ball around the goalkeeper, or having that kind of confidence in front of goal that he had. One-on-ones, I think he was unsurpassed. I never ever got anywhere near his sorts of level in any sense. But those sorts of, you try. I think as a youngster, you try and emulate those sorts of players, don't you? The player that you're playing in the same position as. So, but they're all kind of heroes. I mean, I know quite a number of them now. People like Kevin Beattie, obviously I did the radio show with for years and years, and he played in that game against Southampton, but obviously he was not at his best at that stage. That was kind of in the years after the injuries had taken their toll. Terry Butcher played in that game against Southampton at left back, who obviously did live to pitch with us last year. And also players like centre halves, they're often the character of the team, aren't they? Alan Hunter as well. Paul Cooper. I mean, Paul Cooper was a real character in that team. I was never a goalkeeper. I just quite like playing in goal, but I'm far too short for playing in goal, particularly these days when they're all 6'7" or taller in case of Thomas Holly. But in our sort of playground games, Paul Cooper doing that thing of I think it was Derby County game when he saved 2 penalties, and one of them he kind of sort of leant one way to try and persuade the penalty taker. It might have been David Swindlehurst or someone like that, or Jerry Daly. I can't remember which one it was. It was 2 penalties in that game, and he kind of went and kind of persuaded him to put it one way and saved it. Every penalty in our playground, the goalkeeper was always leaning one way to try and persuade it after Paul Cooper. So. It was, and of course, you used to see them all around town in those days. And the Dutchman, of course, I haven't mentioned the Dutchman, because the Dutchman's children, Arnold and Francis' children, went to our school, went to Kesgrave Primary School. They're a few years younger than us, but me and my brother. But so we used to see their cars, because in those days, players used to have cars from garages, and they used to have their names sort of hand painted on the side. Franz Tyson drives a car from, and they both had Volvos. From I can't remember what garage it would have been back in, so of course they were sort of pulling up outside the school every day. It's Franz Tyson, and Arnold Muren, and and they kind of felt quite close to us in a way, that those players, and Alan Brazil, I think, lived in Kesgrove for a bit, and as you say, it's very difficult to pick anyway. But of course, there's other eras. We're only covering that era when I was a child so far. I mean, my sort of Ipswich support drifted a little bit really in the late 80s, I would say, mid to late 80s. Other things sort of come along, and music, particular bands and all that kind of thing. You get more into those sorts of things, and obviously the Robson team broke up, and we weren't. And I think a lot of people, perhaps my age, drifted away a bit at that point. And then, of course, you've got the John Lyall era and the 91-92 promotion, when I think reinvigorated the club really, and reinvigorated a lot of supporters who perhaps drifted away, particularly as it came from absolutely nothing really. The season before we finished 14th, something like that, and there was no real expectation. And I think as that season went on, it was such a growing, I'll do it that way, a growing process. As the season went on, I think it encouraged lots of people who maybe had whose interest had waned a little bit in the previous years to come back, and that totally got me back into town. And by that time I was at university and living in Hull, but I was still kind of, I was taking weeks off, adding a week to a holiday because we'd got a game the next week, an important one and stuff. So that season, and people like Jason Dizelle obviously was probably the key player in that team, and then Chris Kiwomya scoring all the goals. Neil Thompson being a left footer. Neil Thompson, you have to kind of admire Neil Thompson's left foot and his big diagonal ball to Steve Whitten, who was a great player in that era. And of course, Walkie was back again for a third spell at that point. And so those players during that era, Walkie was kind of talismanic figure for all of us, I think, in that period. When I used to wander around Hull in my Ipswich shirt, it was pretty much John Walk that everyone wanted to. Is John Walk still playing? That was the kind of topic of conversation. And we were so good in that era, weren't we? In the Premier League, and it was so sort of it was such a positive era, that sort of promotion year, and then the following year when we started the season so well, and I think I can remember going back for the start of my second year, my mate who was from Ireland, RTE, had shown Ipswich Leeds the previous day, and he was a Leeds fan, and we'd won 4-2, and then he thought, you're not really good, aren't they? And that sort of era. So it's very difficult, and of course coming further on, you've got the Burley era. I mean, obviously we talk about 2000, but it was a build over a number of years from that relegation in '95. Through to 2000 and the season when we got into the UEFA Cup. So many players through that era, really. I mean, Alex Matthew for the hat-trick against Norwich and his general kind of goal scoring. David Johnson, really, really consistent goal scorer through that period. I think I'd have probably liked to have been a David Johnson type striker, similar sort of build, a bit chunkier than me. I quite admire those sorts of number 9s, because that's sort of what the role that I tended to play when I was younger. And Jim Agilton obviously was the heartbeat of that team, wasn't he? Kieran was obviously one of our own. There were a number of them like that. Richard Wright in goal, James Scowcroft, and we always have that sort of greater affinity with players from who have come through the system. Titus as well, when he came through. And I'm trying to think. Yeah, there's too many. I mean, and also kind of players who kind of had a special affinity with fans, like Mauricio Taricco through that period. He's certainly been one of my favourite players during a period of time, and Fabian as well, another one who sort of seemed to kind of have that connection with fans that not every player does. I mean, sometimes it's not necessarily the greatest player, but some players get an additional affinity, don't they, with fans, and a greater connection than others. So, yeah. How many have I listed? Is that, you said favourite player, not favourite 31 or something? Yeah.
Run out of hands. But,
and they're also great players that you have a lot of respect for and time for, even in less successful sides. I mean, the Joe Royal team was so unlucky, wasn't it? Again, Jim and Fabian were obviously key people in that team as well. And Shefke, another great man, and a real town hero. And Darren Bent, again, another one from that period. And it sort of more recently, people like Chambo, who obviously have got that, who's been such a sort of a strong leader, but unfortunately for him, in teams that have been largely unsuccessful. But again, you go back. I sort of said before, I think on the radio, that when I was growing up, I couldn't imagine anyone else being Town captain other than Mick Mills. And I think probably people growing up now, Luke Chambers is a real sort of really good captain, I think, and it's been very unfortunate that his time here has been one where things have been less successful. But yeah, so that's I think we're up to about 35 now, aren't we? Is that? And probably a lot of people will pick the same game, I'm sure. The playoff second leg against Bolton was an incredible match. Not just for as a game on its own, it was an incredible match, but the kind of context of it, of the previous few years, playoffs, and the fact that Bolton the previous year they'd beaten us in the playoff then, and again we were very unfortunate. Really, probably should have had a penalty in the away leg the previous year. Kieran scoring that header that levelled things, and I think we thought we were probably going to go on to win at that point. And so in the overall context, I think, and context is a lot of it with football matches, isn't it? It's not just the kind of game in isolation. But yeah, that was such a remarkable match that swung one way, swung the other, and that Jim Magilton, not someone renowned for scoring loads of goals, should get a hat trick. And there's so many stories around the game as well. The sort of questions asked in Parliament by the MP for Bolton because whether the referee was. You look through all those decisions and you think, well, hang on, that was definitely a red. That was definitely a red. That was definitely a penalty. That was so. Yeah, there was so much. I think that's probably the most extraordinary game. I think Nielski used to write poetry for us on TWTD. I think he said it's the kind of game they write operas about, and I think that was that pretty much sums it up. Really, it was an extraordinary match, and Wembley, of course, after that was another extraordinary afternoon. Yes, other games Derby victories, obviously. The 5-0 at home was particularly memorable. I think, particularly as one of our friends is a Norwich supporter, so that was particularly good. The away at Norwich when I think it was Fabian and Darren Bent scored and won 2-0. I remember that one very fondly. And then that year back in the Premier League, really, when I think as that season started to build, I think we won 3-0 at Everton fairly early on. And that's when you started to think, hang on, something's happening here. We're doing quite well. And then 3-0 against Tottenham, probably a row between my dad and his brother after that one. The other one that I remember is another one that's fairly early was Leeds 2-1. That, I think, that kind of the Tractor Boys chant sort of came out of that one. There was that game. I think Jammer scored, didn't he? I think the winner in that, and then Manchester City won 3-2 at Manchester City, but it was a 3-2, where I think we were 3-0 up at some stage, and it was a very comfortable 3-2 rather than a kind of sort of narrow 3-2. And you started to kind of so those sorts of days. I can remember one of the goals against Manchester City and sort of the players. And the fans, there was this. For some reason, I was almost at the front, and I can remember the players looking as absolutely sort of so delighted at how they were doing, and this kind of almost sort of realization at that point that we're doing all right. There was this kind of growth in the team and the confidence and amongst the fans and amongst the players themselves during that sort of period. So those games were probably special as well. I'm trying to think of it's disappointing that so many of them are sort of quite such a long time ago now. Even the relatively recent games that I'm talking about are best part of 20 years ago now, which is quite frustrating, really. But there's obviously there's great afternoons in any season. I think when you go away from home and you win, the trip back goes that much quicker, doesn't it? And when you pick up an unlikely away win against somebody, they're always amongst the best, I think.
Now, once again, and this is a question where there's going to be loads of options because there's been so many goals during the years. So from belters to very important goals for yourself. I know it's hard to just pick one, but have you got a few to mention as well?
Yeah, obviously I'll come up with about 48 again. Well, actually, I was thinking about, again, those playoffs in 2000. Everyone talks about the Roycer goals, which were fantastic and brilliant. But they actually sealed it, really, rather than being the really kind of important ones, or, the sort of being decisive. Jamie Clapham's penalty, I think, probably is a bit forgotten as probably one of the most important penalties anyone has ever scored for Ipswich, because obviously that put us ahead, didn't it, for the first time on the night? Would that be probably the first time in the tie, wouldn't it? That must have been a nervy old penalty to take, because I don't think he'd ever taken a penalty before for us, had he? So yeah, and I can remember after the game where I was on the pitch, I was doing some filming for the National Football Museum at the 2 playoffs games. They'd sent me a camera, and they were doing a thing on the playoffs, fans, just terrace stuff and whatever. And so we did a road movie almost, just sort of picking people up at stations and things, and for the away game. So I did a bit of filming on the terraces, and then a bit of the similar sort of stuff at the home game anyway. But I was on the pitch filming afterwards, and there was a guy who was guarding the penalty spot. He wouldn't let anyone near this sacred kind of relic of the penalty spot that Jamie Clapham had scored that penalty from. But those goals, I'm trying to think what else. Obviously, I mean, I can 81 obviously was another one that I've not really mentioned. For some reason, I don't really remember 81. I don't think the 81 final was shown live. I may be wrong. I can remember this. I used to listen to a lot of the away games on Radio Orwell and Radio 2, because of course they were on Radio 2, because they were big games in those stations. Radio 2 was obviously where the live commentaries were in that day, in that day and age. But greatest goal, as in kind of, as in sort of strike or whatever, you know what I mean? There was that, the Jermaine Wright one, of course. I think people talk about, is it Crew? That was a particularly that was particularly well taken, wasn't it? Marcus Stewart at Liverpool, I think it takes some beating for one of those. It was just sort of, which is again quite similar to his one in the first leg at Bolton, wasn't it? Where he just sort of waltzed round and then went back again, went round them a couple more times, and then just sort of tucked it in the corner. And there was another one I saw of Marcus Stewart's the other day that I'd forgotten about, where he again did similar sorts of things, just sort of went around and stopped, check where the cameras were, and then put it in the corner, and so yeah, those, yes, I mean, sure, but going back to the first game I went to, the Gatesy goal in that game was terrific, and other ones from that 2000 and that era. There were some terrific free kicks from Martin Roycer. I can't remember too many better free kicks from people than Martin Roycer during that era. When you're talking that sort of great goals, great set piece goals or whatever. I don't really have any particular one that kind of stands out for its sort of. I mean, there was a goal a couple of years ago against Sunderland, which I particularly liked. I can't even remember. I think it was kind of Selena flicked it into the path of what's his name? And anyway, it was the little flick that made it. Waghorn, yeah, it was Mike Waghorn. I was trying to think which of the strikers had scored it. But it was it's kind of like, so I suppose there's goals in every. Another one, Tarico, in the Norwich game. I thought that was a particularly kind of memorable goal. Jason Dezell's second. I remember the Jason Dezell's second in the 3-1 against Norwich at Portman Road, when he hit it low and hard, and it just sort of just crept in the corner. That was Mickey Stockwell. There was, I think, the same game when he kind of battled his way through and sort of rode tackles to kind of put that. That's a different sort of great goal, but it just showed that tenacity, and it typified him as a player. Of course, his goal. I mean, people talk about his goals. The one at Wimbledon. Mm-hmm. Where he just sort of dribbled his way through everybody and scored. I mean, there's for players dribbling their way through and scoring in that way. There's few better. I don't think Gio scored many like that. But Mickey Stockwell scored a terrific one like that. And I mean, Alex Matthew against Norwich. Yeah, again, I'm getting into the 50s on best goals now, aren't we? It's there's too many. I think the classic 78s with the collar. I had the one with the collar, which was I think it was probably one of the first replica kits that they produced. It was the first Adidas kit they had, wasn't it? And then the following year, or they had it without the collar, didn't they? And so certainly that kit probably is the classic Ipswich kit for me, I would say. And the kits of recent years have been modelled upon it to some degree, I think. So since we've been back with Adidas, so that the pinstripes was all right. Yeah, I quite like the pinstripes as well. I wasn't so keen on the one with the red stripe across it, the sort of France tribute. What have we had more recently? Yeah, the Green King kits. I quite like the Green King kits with the white sleeves. And actually the Fisons kit back in the Premier League. I quite like that one. I know a lot of people didn't really go for that, but it's kind of, I think sometimes it's the kit is just a sort of it just sort of reminds you, it's like a kind of Madeline moment type thing, the sort of visual Madeline moment of the times that they represent, what they bring back. You see that kit from that we won the UEFA Cup in, and you kind of you're sort of back to that era, and yeah, I think and the Adidas kits in recent years, I've quite liked them. I thought they've been decent enough. I think that's because of that connection. I think it's probably because it has that connection with that very successful era. But yeah, I think certainly that. Anyway, I've actually given you a proper answer for this one. I've not kind of come up with that. But yeah, I think certainly that sort of 77, 78 kit that we won the FA Cup in with the collars, I think I'd pick that as my favourite. Yeah. I mean, obviously relegations are quite bad generally, but most of the relegations we've had, I think, they've not really been a day. We've not had those relegations where it's all turned on a sixpence sort of thing. And on the final day we've been at, except for when we lost 5 at Liverpool. I think if we'd have won that day, or results had gone our way that day, we wouldn't have been relegated. So that was I can remember that being a very long trip and long day. But the playoffs, again, the playoff failures to Sheffield United and Charlton and then Bolton, I mean, that's pretty bleak. You've got a season that's going that runs for quite a long time, and you've got all that hope and expectation, and in a number of those seasons we were there or thereabouts for automatic promotion. And of course the same in the Joe Royle era as well, with the West Ham games. And yeah, so I think kind of those Charlton, I can remember feeling it being real kind of feeling of kind of it's a bit of feeling of emptiness on the terraces after that game when we lost 1-0 home goal, wasn't it? And Jamie Clapham, which obviously gives a bit more context to his winning penalty a couple of years later. And yeah, I think those Sheffield United. I mean, that was pretty. One of my best friends is a Sheffield United supporter, so that didn't help much there either. Yeah, that was because we were better than them. We knew we were better than them, and that was a real frustration. And yeah, I can remember a few people crying. I remember there was actually my mate at the time, my mate's then girlfriend. She was crying, and she was actually pictured in the Star the next day. And little did they know that she was crying, one, because Ipswich had lost, but also because she was a Sheffield Wednesday fan, actually. And she was quite distraught that Sheffield United had won, as well. So I think, and the Bolton one the following year, when Kieran got that header, it did seem like it was kind of, he's even said that to me, that when he scored that header, he thought it was written in the stars, it was local boy, does, and kind of brings town back and go on to win. And I think, however long you've been watching football, and we all get a bit cynical about football and how, and we learn we still kind of see those stories happening in front of us, and we kind of hope that that's how it's how it's going to happen for us, and of course it didn't. And that was the third year in a row at that point. And you think, oh God, are we ever going to get into the? Because we knew every year we were probably capable of beating anybody in that division. And then finally, for it to happen, obviously, this is what we'll come to next. So I think there. I mean, obviously, derby defeats are quite bad as well. We don't want to dwell on those, but I think when your whole season has eventually kind of is on one game, and then the whistle goes, and that's it. The whole kind of campaign is over, and another few months, and I think I don't think it's a surprise sometimes that McCarthy used to talk about playoff hangovers, and I don't think it's any surprise that players perhaps have that because they're so vested in that in the same way as fans are. And I think they're probably the sort of lowest moments.
Well then, let's get to your best moment as a Town fan, and well, you've already mentioned it already, so take it away.
Yeah, well, I think the Royce goal at Wembley, which sealed it, didn't it? Because it was a bit nervy, wasn't it, for a little bit before that. That I think we all knew at that point, didn't we? That was it. We were in the Premier League finally after all the kind of years of knocking at the door and all the disappointments. That was finally there. And I remember I talked to Matt Holland about it. And I said, well, because for me as a fan at that point, it was as well as elation, there was relief because it was so many years of and he said the same thing, that they felt the same sort of thing to some degree as players, that finally, because they dealt with these accusations of being bottlers and all this kind of nonsense that had gone on. And so I think that was pretty special, really. I think that, and again, 92. I think 92 can't be overlooked as well. It didn't have. I mean, well, I wasn't at Oxford. I mean, obviously, Oxford was the game when they won the title, but I wasn't there. But I can remember listening to it on the radio and kind of doing the maths and working out, we're up, and not only we're up, we're champions. But that season again, that was such a special season for us because there was so little expectation, and to get promoted into the first Premier League, which obviously, so there was that much more about it. So one of those two probably. I mean, I can go back to kind of the cup final I watched on the telly, which is obviously a fantastic moment for all of us. But I was 7, so I don't really. And I was obviously loved it at the time, but I wasn't kind of as immersed in it as I was. I think that's the word, really. Kind of, I wasn't living it in quite the way that I was in that period. Do you know what I mean? Through the playoff years, certainly.
And I want to finish this, feature with asking about, what you do now as your day-to-day job. TWTD. Those are the days back then. How's that sort of? Yes. It's got a bit dark now. We've been speaking for so long.
I know.
But yes,
well, it's. I was going to say, actually, when I started talking to you about my first game and having been to reserve games, I actually already written an article about Town before I went to my first match, because we had. I was in the Cubs at Kesgrave, and we were given a tour of the ground. And I can vaguely remember being in the gym upstairs, which is now not really used as a gym. I think it's used for storage and whatever, but it was new at the time. And and anyway, afterwards we were kind of told to, as part of a sort of a thank you to the club, I think we were all sort of told to write an article about it, and the best one would go in the parish magazine. So I wrote something. I didn't really have any expectation again. Anyway, mine, I was very surprised when mine won and was published in the Kesgrave Parish magazine in about 1977, I would guess. So, and here we are 43 years on, and I'm essentially doing the same thing. So they do say this, don't they? You could bring me a child at 7 and I'll show you the man. But so how did I get involved in TWC? Well, I'd left university. I hadn't really written anything about football, but a friend of mine, Steve Mellon, who he'd written a few pieces for the fanzine, as was at the time, and we were both in a position where we just left university and we're a bit directionless at that point. And he was offered the editorship by somebody, but by Gavin Barber and Phil Arnold, who were the previous editors. And then he sort of was talking about it in the pub, and I said, well, if you want to do it, I'll do it with you, sort of thing. Not envisaging that it would turn into anything. Well, yeah, it was just the kind of thing to get a bit of experience, really, and write a few things. So we took that on. Steve did it for sort of 2 or 3 years. Meanwhile, I kind of went to university and learned a bit about the internet, and it seemed to be a good sort of, you know, what's the word? A good fit with the two together. Gavin Wilding sort of, I mean, really, there was virtually nothing at the website at that point. It was just a few articles in the fanzine, and that was it. This is sort of 1995-ish. Gavin Wilding came in, really, who's a programmer, and he got much more of an idea of what the capabilities of the web were at that point, and the message board started at that point, and then 2 or 3 years later we started doing the news, and our traffic started to get to the point where it was quite significant, and then Rivals.net came in. They were sort of a venture where they were putting together 92 websites like TWTD, and at that point we started making money out of it. They lasted a few years, but it never really took off as they would hoped it did, and various other things sort of came and went, and we ended up doing it independently. And so really I've been doing TWTD full time whilst doing bits of freelance for the Star one time, and Life's a Pitch. Did that for 7 years until last summer, which I think may well come back at some point once we're back to a semblance of normality. And also write for the Culture Gazette, which I've done for a number of years as well. Other bits of freelance here and there. So ultimately, it sort of took over my life without really there ever being any intention that it would be a career as such. But it's but I think kind of when my 7-year-old self who was watching, or 8-year-old self who was going to that Southampton game and seeing Kevin Beattie and Terry Butcher and people, and John Walker, I wrote stuff for TWTD with at one point, and I think he'd kind of be pinching himself, really, that kind of how things had kind of worked out, really, in terms of a career. So sort of here we find ourselves 26 years on from me starting getting involved in TWTD, and it's sort of become part of the town landscape, really, hasn't it? I think not just through my efforts or even Gavin's efforts as well, but the forum and is obviously a collective effort of of all those who engage and get involved on it. And I think that's kind of it has a bit of a sort of character of its own, really. And and I think it's been a kind of positive thing, I think, generally for amongst supporters over the years. I think supporters clubs of local branches of supporters clubs have been formed, and friendships have been formed, and couples have got together, and children have been, new town fans have come from things like that. So it's so it's been it's one of these sort of things it was never intended to. It's something never intended to sort of become a job or a career that gradually has done, and I think most people would quite like it if their hobby turned into their job.
Definitely. Well, Phil, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your time. Anything else you want to add before we finish up here?
No, not really. I think we've covered quite a lot, really, haven't we? It's just interesting to look back on all the eras, really, and just sort of think. Because whatever era, whatever level a team is at, there are heroes, aren't there? Do you know what I mean? If we go up from League One at some point, I mean, someone like Richard Naylor, for example, not going away from Ipswich, but when he was at Leeds, what would it have been like for him to be captain of Leeds, his local club, and taking them up from League One? That must have felt great, So, so if we go up from League One over the next year or this year or next year, the players that do that will kind of, will be heroes to some degree, the same as the greats of the club at a higher level, because football's changed such a lot over the last 25 years that it's unlikely that we're ever going to be a UEFA Cup team again. It's much less likely that we're going to win the FA Cup again. So I think, as I say, you kind of look back on all these eras at different sort of levels. There are always heroes emerging, and favourite players and favourite goals and favourite matches. And let's hope there's a few more of them to come in the relatively soon. I'm thinking perhaps with fans back would be very nice as well, because obviously not many people can enjoy them as much without. And so, it would be nice to be able to talk about these successful games being within the last 2 or 3 years rather than 20 odd, 30 odd, 40 odd years ago.
Definitely. Well, Phil, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.